I had just landed after a 5-hour delay, clutching a single wrapped gift from my mother that I'd carefully chosen weeks earlier. The airport was packed with families rushing to embrace each other, their faces glowing with Christmas joy. I texted my parents to let them know I was at baggage claim, expecting the usual response about where to meet them in the pickup area. Instead, my mom replied with words that made my blood run cold: "Change of plans. You'll have to figure it out. We're already at the lodge." No apology. No explanation. No offer to send money for a cab or arrange alternative transportation. Just a cold dismissal, like I was an inconvenience they'd suddenly decided they couldn't be bothered with. I stared at the message for a full minute, reading it over and over, hoping I'd misunderstood something. But there was no mistaking the meaning. My own parents had abandoned me at the airport on Christmas Eve, treating me like I wasn't even family. The holiday travelers around me continued their joyful reunions while I stood frozen with my suitcase, holding a gift that suddenly felt meaningless in my hands. I waited outside the airport for 2 hours, shivering in a thin coat that wasn't designed for December weather. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs as I stood at the curb with my luggage. They hadn't even left money for a cab, and the ride to their mountain lodge would cost at least $80 that I didn't have. People rushed past me constantly, throwing their arms around loved ones who'd come to collect them, loading presents into warm cars, chattering excitedly about Christmas plans. I watched family after family drive away while I remained on the sidewalk like a forgotten piece of luggage. My phone stayed silent. No follow-up messages asking if I'd found a ride safely. No calls checking if I was okay. Nothing. As the sky grew darker and the airport crowds thinned out, I realized the horrible truth: my parents genuinely didn't care whether I made it to Christmas or not. I was completely on my own, abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me most. The rejection cut deeper than the cold wind that whipped through the pickup area. The reason for their cruelty had emerged a week earlier during what I'd thought was a casual family phone call. My sister Isabella was planning her dream destination wedding in Italy, and apparently the family trust fund was being tapped to help finance the elaborate celebration. "We need everyone to sign off on using part of the inheritance," my mother had explained in that tone she used when she expected immediate compliance. "It's just money, Elise. Don't be selfish about it." But it wasn't just money to me. It was my grandfather's legacy, money he'd specifically set aside for his grandchildren's futures, not for extravagant parties. When I politely declined to contribute my share, my mother's voice turned icy. "You're ruining the spirit of the family," she said. "Isabella deserves her perfect day, and you're being petty and small-minded." The conversation escalated quickly, with accusations flying about my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to ruin anything, that I simply believed the trust money should be used for its intended purpose. But my reasonable arguments fell on deaf ears. By the end of the call, I knew I'd crossed some invisible line in my family's eyes. Desperate and freezing, I started calling every friend I could think of. But it was Christmas Eve, and everyone was either with their own families or traveling to holiday destinations. "I'm so sorry, Elise," my college roommate said, "but I'm already in Boston with my parents." Another friend was skiing in Colorado. My work colleagues were scattered across the country. Each conversation reinforced how alone I really was, how few people I could count on in a genuine emergency. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was stranded by my own family while calling near strangers for help. I sat down on my suitcase, feeling tears threaten to spill over. The airport pickup area was emptying out as the evening flights concluded, and soon I'd be alone in the darkness with nowhere to go. I didn't want to cry in public, especially not surrounded by the lingering echoes of other people's happy reunions, but I could feel my composure cracking like ice. The wave of despair was building, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to hold it back much longer. I needed a miracle, or at least a friend who wasn't celebrating Christmas somewhere else. In my desperation, I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't called in over a year: James Carlisle, my late grandfather's former attorney. We had met only briefly during the estate settlement, but he'd been kind and professional throughout the complicated process. More importantly, He'd handed me his card at the end and said, "If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call me." I'd thought it was just polite professional courtesy, but now I was desperate enough to find out if he'd meant it. My hands shook as I dialed his number, partly from cold and partly from embarrassment. It was Christmas Eve, after all, and I was essentially calling a near stranger to rescue me from my family's abandonment. I didn't expect him to answer. Most people would be with their families, celebrating the holiday, not taking calls from clients' granddaughters. But on the third ring, I heard his voice. "Elise? Is everything all right?" The concern in his tone was immediate and genuine, and for the first time in hours, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe I wouldn't be spending Christmas Eve alone in an airport after all. 40 minutes later, a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb where I'd been waiting. The driver stepped out and opened the back door, and James emerged, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Despite the late hour and unexpected nature of my call, he looked composed and elegant, like rescuing stranded young women was something he did regularly. "Elise," he said gently, his voice carrying the same warmth I remembered from our previous meetings. "Get in. You're not spending tonight alone." His matter-of-fact kindness was overwhelming after hours of my family's cold rejection. I wanted to apologize for bothering him, for dragging him away from his own Christmas Eve plans, but he waved away my stammered thanks. "We'll talk once you're warm," he said, helping me into the car's luxurious interior. The heated seats felt like heaven against my frozen body, and the soft jazz playing quietly through the sound system was a soothing contrast to the airport's chaos. As we pulled away from the terminal, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Whatever happened next, I was safe and no longer alone. What I didn't fully understand then was that James wasn't just any attorney. He was a founding partner of one of the world's most prestigious international law firms, a man who regularly counseled Fortune 500 CEOs and dined with diplomats. His client list read like a who's who of global power players, and his reputation in legal circles was legendary. But that night, sitting beside me in the car, he seemed more concerned with my comfort than his own importance. He handed me a thermos of hot tea that he'd apparently prepared before leaving his apartment, along with a soft cashmere blanket. "Drink this," he said quietly. "It'll help with the shock." The tea was perfectly prepared, warming me from the inside out, and the blanket smelled like expensive cologne and something indefinably comforting. He didn't ask probing questions about why my family had abandoned me or make me relive the humiliation of being stranded. Instead, he created a bubble of quiet warmth that felt like the first genuine care I'd experienced in months. This successful, powerful man had dropped everything on Christmas Eve to help someone he barely knew, and he was treating me with more consideration than my own parents had shown. He brought me to his apartment, a stunning brownstone in the West Village that looked like something from a luxury magazine. The moment we stepped inside, I was enveloped by warmth and elegance. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the book-lined walls. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, and the space felt both sophisticated and welcoming. "Welcome to my home," he said, helping me out of my coat. The living room was decorated with understated Christmas touches, a small but perfect tree in the corner, tasteful garland along the mantelpiece, and the subtle scent of pine and cinnamon in the air. It was the kind of Christmas setting I'd dreamed about as a child, warm and peaceful without being overwhelming. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I can make something simple." I wasn't sure if I was hungry or just emotionally drained, but his offer felt like another layer of care I wasn't used to receiving. The contrast between this sanctuary and my cold abandonment at the airport was so stark it almost made me dizzy. Here was a man I barely knew, treating me with more kindness than my own family had managed in years. He showed me to the guest room, which was decorated in soft blues and whites with a comfortable bed that looked like a cloud. "The bathroom is just across the hall," he said, setting my suitcase on a luggage stand I hadn't even noticed was there. "Take your time settling in. We'll figure out everything else tomorrow." There was no pressure, no expectations, just simple hospitality offered without strings attached. I accepted gratefully, still somewhat in shock from the evening's events. After he left me alone, I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to cry. The tears came in waves. Relief at being safe, grief over my family's betrayal, and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was gratitude for discovering that kindness still existed in the world, even when it came from unexpected sources. I fell asleep that night with tear-stained cheeks but also with a full heart. It had been years since anyone had shown me such uncomplicated care, and despite the circumstances that had brought me here, I felt more at peace than I had in months. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't wondering if I was wanted somewhere. Christmas morning arrived with the soft smell of cinnamon rolls and freshly brewed coffee. I found James in the kitchen, moving around with practiced ease as he prepared what looked like a feast for two. The dining table was set with elegant china, real silver flatware, and cloth napkins that probably cost more than most people's entire Christmas dinner. He poured coffee into delicate cups like it was the most natural thing in the world, as if hosting stranded acquaintances for Christmas breakfast was his regular routine. "Good morning," he said with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see me. "I hope you slept well." I had, better than I'd slept in weeks, actually. As we sat down to eat, I whispered, "Thank you for not making me feel like a burden." The words came out before I could stop them, revealing more vulnerability than I'd intended. He paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips and looked at me with something that might have been surprise. "You're not a burden, Elise," he said quietly. "You're excellent company, and I'm glad you called me." The sincerity in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. After years of feeling like an obligation to my family, his simple acceptance felt revolutionary. My phone remained silent all morning. Not a single message from my parents asking if I'd found a safe place to stay or if I'd made it through the night okay. No calls from my sister checking on my welfare or apologizing for the family's behavior. Nothing. I stared at the blank screen for hours, willing it to light up with some sign that they cared about my well-being, but it never came. Finally, I turned the phone off entirely and put it in my purse. I was done waiting for scraps of consideration from people who'd made it clear I didn't matter to them. James noticed my mood shift but didn't pry. Instead, he suggested we watch old movies and drink hot chocolate, treating my obvious sadness with gentle distraction rather than uncomfortable questions. If you're moved by this story of unexpected kindness during family betrayal, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Because sometimes the most beautiful connections happen when we least expect them. I was done begging to be considered worthy of basic human decency. Some people just aren't capable of giving what you need, and accepting that truth was both heartbreaking and liberating. Later that afternoon, James handed me a small wrapped box that I hadn't noticed in place under the tree. "I hope you don't mind," he said, looking almost shy. "I picked this up after you called last night." Inside was a set of vintage fountain pens in a beautiful wooden case, each one carefully restored and perfectly balanced. "I remember you wrote with these during your grandfather's estate reading," he said. "You're a writer, Elise. Don't stop writing just because some people don't appreciate what you have to say." I was stunned by his thoughtfulness and his attention to details I hadn't even realized he'd noticed. The pens were clearly expensive and had been chosen with genuine care. More than that, his encouragement touched something deep inside me that had been dormant for months. My family had always dismissed my writing as a hobby, something cute but ultimately impractical. But James saw it as a gift worth nurturing. Holding those beautiful pens, I felt a spark of creative energy I hadn't experienced in years. Maybe it was time to stop hiding my talents and start believing in them the way he seemed to believe in them. That evening, over dinner by the fireplace, I learned more about James as a person rather than just my grandfather's attorney. He told me about his work, his travels to exotic places for international cases, and his quiet grief after losing his wife 5 years earlier to cancer. "Eleanor would have loved you," he said with a sad smile. She had a soft spot for intelligent women who weren't afraid to stand up for themselves. There was something profoundly peaceful about the way he spoke, never boastful or loud, just present in the conversation in a way that made me feel heard and valued. He asked thoughtful questions about my writing, my dreams, my thoughts on books and art and travel. It had been so long since anyone had been genuinely curious about my inner life that I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. We talked until late into the night, and when I finally went to bed, I realized I'd laughed more in one evening than I had in the previous 6 months combined. James had the rare gift of making people feel interesting and worthwhile, and I was beginning to understand why he was so successful in his professional life. I had planned to book a hotel room the next day and start figuring out my life from there, but James insisted I stay until New Year's. "We'll figure things out from there," he said in that calm, assured way he had of making everything seem manageable. He didn't push or pressure me, he simply made the offer and left me free to accept or decline. But honestly, I didn't want to leave. His apartment had become a sanctuary where I felt valued and peaceful, a sharp contrast to the anxiety and constant criticism I'd grown accustomed to in my family relationships. He gave me space to process my emotions while also providing gentle companionship when I needed it. We fell into an easy routine of shared meals, quiet conversations, and comfortable silences. He worked from his home office during the day while I wrote at the kitchen table, both of us existing in the same space without feeling obligated to entertain each other constantly. It was the kind of natural compatibility I'd never experienced before, and it scared me a little. I was starting to care about this man in ways that went beyond gratitude for his rescue. That felt dangerous, but also exciting in a way I hadn't felt in years. The spell was broken on December 28th when my sister finally called. "You embarrassed Mom," Isabella said without preamble, her voice sharp with accusation. "She cried on Christmas Day because of your selfishness." I felt my stomach clench with the familiar guilt she was so skilled at triggering. "You left me at an airport," I replied quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You abandoned me on Christmas Eve like I was nothing." But Isabella was having none of it. "You always make everything about you," she snapped. "This was supposed to be about family, about celebrating together, and you ruined it with your stubbornness about money that doesn't even matter." Money that doesn't matter. Easy for her to say when she was the one benefiting from it. I realized as I listened to her familiar manipulation tactics that nothing had changed. Even my abandonment at the airport was somehow my fault in their narrative. I was tired of being the family scapegoat, tired of apologizing for having boundaries, tired of being blamed for other people's bad behavior. "I'm done with this conversation," I said calmly, and hung up the phone. It was the first time in my life I'd ended a call with Isabella, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. That night, I wrote my parents a letter that I never intended to send. It poured out of me like water through a broken dam, years of hurt, frustration, and disappointment that I'd never been allowed to express. "You don't have to accept me," I wrote. "But I am done asking to be accepted. I'm done pretending that your love comes with reasonable conditions, and I'm done sacrificing my well-being for people who see me as a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be cherished." The words felt powerful on paper, each sentence a small act of rebellion against a lifetime of trying to earn love that was always just out of reach. I wrote about the loneliness of growing up in a family where approval was conditional and criticism was constant. I wrote about watching Isabella receive unconditional support while my achievements were minimized and my needs ignored. Most importantly, I wrote about discovering what genuine care looked like through James's unexpected kindness. Writing the letter was cathartic, even though I knew I'd never send it. Sometimes the act of putting truth on paper is enough, even when you're not brave enough to share that truth with the people who need to hear it. But reading my own words back to myself, I realized how much damage had been done over the years, and how much healing I still needed to do. The next evening, James invited me to a formal dinner party at a colleague's penthouse apartment. "You don't have to come," he said carefully, "but I thought you might enjoy getting out and meeting some new people." He had a dress delivered earlier that day, a stunning navy blue cocktail dress in exactly my size, elegant without being flashy. I'd never owned anything so beautiful, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the confident woman staring back at me. The party was filled with interesting, accomplished people, artists, writers, business leaders, diplomats. All conversing intelligently about topics that actually mattered. James introduced me simply as my friend Elise, and people seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. When someone asked what I did, I found myself saying, "I'm a writer," with more confidence than I'd ever felt about that identity before. Several people assumed James and I were a couple, and he didn't correct them. Neither did I. There was something thrilling about being seen as part of a pair with this sophisticated, successful man, something that made me feel valuable in a way I'd never experienced. As we moved through the party together, I caught glimpses of us in mirrors and windows, and we looked right together somehow, like we belonged in each other's orbit. As we prepared to leave the party, James helped me into my coat with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that felt both charming and natural. The winter air was crisp and clean, and the city looked magical with all its Christmas lights still twinkling in windows and along building facades. As we walked to his car, he leaned close and whispered, "You were breathtaking tonight, Elise. You lit up every conversation you joined." His words sent warmth spreading through my chest in a way that had nothing to do with the coat he'd bought me. I felt my heart stutter in the cold night air, suddenly aware of how close we were standing, how his breath looked like small clouds in the freezing temperature, how his eyes looked almost black in the streetlight. There was something different about the way he was looking at me, something that made the space between us feel charged with possibility. "Thank you," I managed to say, though the words felt inadequate for what I was feeling. "For everything. For saving me, for tonight, for making me feel like..." I trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Like what?" he asked softly. "Like I matter," I whispered. His smile in response was gentle and sad and something else I couldn't quite identify. But it made my pulse race in the most wonderful way. New Year's Eve arrived with unexpected snow and a quiet evening at home. James had been invited to several parties, but he chose to stay in with me instead, cooking an elaborate dinner and opening a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. We watched the countdown on television, laughing at the silly interviews and making predictions about the coming year. As midnight approached, I felt a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation building in my chest. When the clock struck 12 and fireworks exploded across the TV screen, I turned to wish James a happy new year and found him looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences, I kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, just a gentle press of lips that lasted only a moment. He looked surprised, his eyes wide and searching my face as if he was trying to read my intentions. Then something shifted in his expression, and he kissed me back. This time it was deeper, more certain, like he'd been waiting for permission he hadn't dared to ask for. I woke up the next morning wrapped in James's arms, my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made the previous night feel almost dreamlike. But it hadn't been a dream. It had been real and beautiful and unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. There was no panic, no regret, no awkward morning after tension. Just warmth and contentment and the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged. "Good morning," he murmured against my hair, his voice husky with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, not moving from my position against his chest. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. Some part of me had been hoping for this since the night he rescued me from the airport. "Maybe we both needed something we didn't know we'd been missing," he replied, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on my bare shoulder. His words resonated with something deep inside me. I had been missing this, not just physical intimacy, but emotional connection with someone who saw me clearly and chose me anyway. With James, I didn't have to earn affection or prove my worth. I was simply accepted and valued for who I was, flaws and all. On January 2nd, a card arrived from my mother. The expensive cream-colored stationery and perfect handwriting were familiar, but the message inside made my blood run cold. "Hope you've learned a lesson about family loyalty and what really matters in life," she'd written. "Your behavior during the holidays was disappointing, but we're prepared to forgive you if you're ready to apologize and do better." There was no acknowledgement of abandoning me at the airport, no recognition that their behavior might have been hurtful or wrong. Just the expectation that I would come crawling back with an apology for their mistreatment of me. I read the card twice, feeling my anger build with each condescending word. Then I walked to the fireplace where James was reading the morning paper and tossed the card into the flames. He looked up, eyebrow raised in silent question. My mother's idea of conflict resolution, I explained, watching the expensive paper curl and blacken in the fire. She thinks abandoning me taught me a lesson about family loyalty. James's expression darkened. The only lesson you should have learned is that some people aren't capable of the love they claim to offer, he said quietly. You deserve so much better than that, Elise. Watching my mother's cruel words turn to ash felt symbolic somehow, like I was finally burning away years of toxic expectations and impossible standards. With James's encouragement, I applied for and was accepted into a prestigious writing fellowship that would allow me to focus on my craft for a full year. This is your chance, he said, reviewing the acceptance letter with obvious pride. Take it. Don't worry about anything else, I'll help you figure out the practical details. He insisted on handling the financial aspects, treating my artistic development as an investment worth making rather than a frivolous expense. We made no grand declarations or big promises about the future. Instead, we settled into a rhythm of quiet mornings with shared coffee, long conversations about everything and nothing, and the slow, steady healing that comes from being truly seen and valued by another person. James never pressured me to define our relationship or make commitments I wasn't ready for. He simply created space for me to grow and discover who I was when I wasn't constantly defending myself against criticism and rejection. For the first time in my adult life, I felt free to pursue my passions without justifying them to anyone. It was intoxicating and terrifying and absolutely necessary for my emotional survival. I was learning what it meant to be loved without conditions, and it was changing everything about how I saw myself and what I believed I deserved. 6 months later, I encountered my parents at a family wedding I couldn't avoid attending. They acted as if nothing had happened, greeting me with fake smiles and casual conversation about the weather and the bride's dress. You look well, my mother said, as if commenting on a distant acquaintance rather than the daughter she'd abandoned at an airport. Thank you, I replied politely, matching her superficial tone. I felt strangely detached from the whole interaction, like I was watching it happen to someone else. Their power to hurt me had diminished dramatically, replaced by the security of knowing I was valued and loved by someone who actually cared about my well-being. They tried to draw me into family photos and conversations about upcoming events, but I remained pleasant and distant. I was done pretending that everything was fine, done protecting their feelings at the expense of my own dignity. My sister Isabella made several pointed comments about my absence from family gatherings, but I let them roll off me like water. I'd been busy with my writing fellowship, I said simply, offering no apologies or explanations for my choices. I didn't owe them my presence or my pain anymore. I had learned to save both for people who deserved them. The real shock came when they discovered who I was with. James attended the wedding as my guest, and my parents' reactions when they realized his identity were priceless. My mother actually stammered when she was introduced to him, clearly recognizing his name from newspaper articles and society pages. You're dating him, she whispered to me during a brief moment when James was speaking with other guests. Her voice carried a mixture of disbelief and sudden calculation, as if she was trying to figure out how to benefit from this unexpected connection. I'm with someone who didn't leave me behind, I said quietly, letting the words carry all the weight of their abandonment and his rescue. Dad looked stunned, probably realizing that the daughter he'd dismissed as unremarkable had somehow attracted the attention of one of the city's most eligible and successful men. Isabella spent the rest of the evening watching us with obvious envy, no doubt wondering how her supposedly inferior sister had managed to find such an impressive partner. But I wasn't with James to prove anything to my family or to make them jealous. I was with him because he made me feel valued and loved and safe in ways I'd never experienced before. The fact that his success and reputation impressed them was just a happy coincidence that highlighted how wrong they'd been about my worth. They left me at the airport on Christmas Eve like I was nothing, treating me as disposable and unworthy of basic consideration. But the man who picked me up that night became so much more than a rescuer. James gave me something my family never could, a place where I was genuinely wanted, love that asked for nothing in return except my authentic self, and a future that belonged entirely to me. He showed me what it felt like to be chosen rather than tolerated, to be celebrated rather than criticized, to be supported rather than undermined. With him, I discovered that I was capable of being loved completely and unconditionally, something I'd never believed possible during my years of trying to earn my family's approval. Our relationship grew from gratitude into genuine affection and then into something deeper and more lasting than I'd ever imagined possible. My parents' cruelty had inadvertently led me to the greatest gift of my life, a man who saw my worth when they couldn't, who valued my dreams when they dismissed them, who offered me partnership when they offered only judgment. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about family loyalty, but instead they taught me the difference between people who love you and people who claim to love you. The ending they never saw coming was that their rejection became my liberation, their abandonment became my salvation, and their loss became the greatest gain of my life. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. Have you ever felt abandoned by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? Have you found unexpected kindness in dark moments? Share your experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories of resilience and unexpected connections. And if this story touched your heart or reminded you that love can come from the most surprising places, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. There are more stories of family dynamics, personal growth, and finding love when you least expect it coming your way. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when someone else closes the door.